What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to this week's episode of the Cut the Crap Show. So today's golden nuggets are going to be coming from a book by psychologist Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic. I have to think about that name for a second. Anyways, I love that name. He's from Argentina, and he's a psychologist, and he wrote a book called Confidence, Overcoming Low Self-Esteem, Insecurity, and Self-Doubt. Now, when people first read this book, if you go and look at the comments, people don't like this book very much. And why? They don't like it because he challenges a lot of these ideas that we have taken as gospel truth. Ideas that you can never have too much confidence, you can never have too much optimism, or that we're all better than average. And he challenges so many of these concepts and tries to bring us back to center. And because he does that, a lot of people don't like this book. But I absolutely love this book because he does provide us with a different perspective. And any book that gives us a different perspective, I want to read that book. So in any case, for today's book, we're talking about confidence and having too much of it. So let's get into this one. First, let's introduce Tomas to you, and then we'll break into the golden nuggets.
Before we kick this off, there have been a number of requests to have you on the show, and requests for different reasons. This one got on my radar because people either love this book or they hate this book. Why are we seeing such a polar opposite amount of people here who both like it and love it? In your experience, why is that?
I think it's just that confidence is a very polarizing topic. Mostly, or historically, we have seen it as something very positive. And I think if you look at the self-help industry, it's mostly an industry whose sole or predominant narrative is to try to boost people's egos and self-esteems, So I think with that comes the assumption that confidence must be a good thing, and the more you have it, the better off you are. Having said that, I also think that in the last 10 years, we've woken up to the reality that when people have too much of it, too much confidence, and they turn up to be global leaders or be in a position of power, status, and influence, what might be advantageous for them or beneficial for them might actually come at the detriment of everyone else. And, so you read the book, so you understand that the message is not that confidence is a bad thing, but that the right amount is the right amount and not too much of it. That ideally you should have as much confidence as you need in order to be aware of your limitations and know what you don't know.
That's right. And we'll get into that a little bit more. The imagery that I had reading the book was of a seesaw. And you have on one side, and I'm going to kind of spoil a little bit for people who haven't read it, but that's okay. You have on one side, you have confidence. On the other side, you have competence. And when your confidence is too high and your competence is too low, certain issues will arise, and vice versa. For people who have read the book, there have been a lot of folks who've reached out to me and said, I had a tough time getting through the first chapter. And I asked why. Why did you have a tough time? Because they said that, well, Tomas is strongly against confidence. He believes that we don't need confidence, and that confidence is downplayed so much so that it almost hurts me to finish reading it. What do you say to those people who are almost violently opposing this opinion when they first read the chapter and they struggle to get through it? What do you say to those people out there?
I mean, if I could make them finish the book, that would be my ask, because I think a lot of the initial thoughts or arguments might seem controversial to begin with, but then they are decoded or unpacked in the other chapters. I also think, by the way, if you're not challenging your preconceptions and you're not willing to understand or accept the fact that some of your preconceptions might be misconceptions, then you shouldn't read a book to begin with. You should only, you can stay within your filter bubble and keep liking, retweeting, or sharing the comments of those who think like you. So I think, I'm also grateful that some people might have gotten the book and gone as far as one chapter, feeling uncomfortable about what's written or disagreeing with it. And I think if, despite that, they manage to finish the book, it shows that they're very open-minded, and we need more open-minded people in the world, for sure.
All right, so let's crack in a golden nugget number one. Golden nugget number one says that we have too much confidence today. Now, why is that? Why do we have too much confidence? Well, We're surrounded by information, whether it be from social media, from Google, from YouTube, whatever. We have so much information at our disposal today that the minute we read a couple articles, we hear a couple podcasts, we watch a couple videos, we feel like we got it all figured out. And in fact, I would argue that we really don't. And myself included, I catch myself on this too. So don't feel bad about this. But Golden Nugget number 1 talks about having too much confidence, and it's really important for you to understand why that is. So let's crack into this one.
That is one of the key takeaways for me. And I love that. And I'm not getting too ahead of myself, but we will talk about this again later on. It's this idea of having such high levels of confidence that we shut off anything that disagrees with our beliefs. We shut off anything that opposes something that we believe. And we are very adamant in our opinions. We are very strong. We have strong conviction in them. And sometimes that conviction comes from reading one article, reading a handful of tweets, reading a comment, or watching a video on Instagram. And it's that kind of culture that is getting us into trouble, where we have a lot of delusion. We have a lot of ignorance. And I believe this book is an antidote to a lot of that. Would you agree or disagree? Is that kind of a half thought, or what are your thoughts?
That certainly was my intention. I know that for some people that was a message, or that's the impact or the effect, and for others, they can get too fixated on certain components to see them. But I think your interpretation is at least aligned with what I had in mind. And perhaps one good starting point for people to understand whether they have read the book or not is this counterintuitive research finding that, contrary to what most people think and contrary to popular belief, confidence, how good you think you are at something, and competence, how good you actually are at something, are very weakly correlated. We know from even the best studies that the correlation is rarely higher than 0.3. That means that there's 9% overlap between the two. So if you imagine two circles in a Venn diagram, the overlap is just 9%. So in 9% of the population, confidence aligns with competence, which means that most of the time you're going to have to choose between one or the other. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I would rather have a dentist, a heart surgeon, a pilot, a financial advisor who is competent rather than confident. And, I love charisma, sense of humor, bravado, and assertiveness, but it kind of helps if people actually know what they're saying and know what they're talking about. And that basically is what the book is about.
That's right. And we'll get into that again in a little bit here. But I want to break into Golden Nugget number 1 to provide some structure for people who maybe haven't read the book, or people who have read the book and they want to understand a little bit more about it. And one of the top questions that I have on it is Golden Nugget number 1. Why is confidence downplayed so much when people value having high confidence? Why is it important that we value having lower confidence?
Mostly because the majority of people in the world have too much of it. And because the right amount of confidence is that which aligns with your actual competence. Simple examples, if I'm about to cross a busy junction, 5 Avenue, it's not so busy now because of the COVID situation, but for most of the past 50, 60 years, it was very busy. And imagine that I think that I can cross and the traffic light is about to change. And actually, I overestimate my ability to get to the other side. I'm probably going to be hit by a car. Equally, if you think you have great musical talent and you're a great singer, you might put yourself forward for an audition. Why are shows like America's Got Talent or Canada's Got Talent or The X Factor so successful and popular? Because when people stand up, and we can see that in their own minds, they are like Pavarotti, but when they open their mouths, they are like a strangled cat. We laugh because we can see how ridiculous a surplus of confidence is, So we have to start with this idea that the right amount is one that actually helps you understand what you know and what you don't know, so that you can work to close the gap and develop some competence. And we also know that the majority of people suffer from too much confidence. The optimism bias is pervasive. You can look up work by my colleague at UCL, Tali Sharot. She has a very good TED Talk on this as well, showing that the majority of people are overly optimistic about how long they will live, how healthy they might be, whether they're going to stay in happy relationships, be promoted, get a bonus. And the lesson from the whole behavioral economics movement, Daniel Kahneman, Tversky, and others, is that overconfidence is the pervasive flaw and bias that we have as humans when we estimate things. So if we accept the fact that too much confidence is bad and most of us have too much confidence, then you have to understand that a less confident world would be a better world. And especially if you think about this from a leadership perspective, I think the majority of organizations and political institutions would improve the quality of their leaders if they could work on lowering their leaders' confidence, not increasing it.
When people listen to that and the opinions that I hear from folks who are reading that, when you say that, I know people have a very strong opposition to that. And they say, how can having lower confidence be a positive thing? And we'll talk about that next. But the one behavioral outcome from that is that with lower confidence, you might be less willing to argue for a specific opinion that you don't have a lot of background about. You might listen more. It'll increase your humility, and it'll force you to be very knowledgeable in specific areas. But today, that's not the case. Today, we're knowledgeable about everything, and we have knowledge about everything, and we have opinions about everything. And in that case, there is overconfidence running rampant in our world. And all you have to do is go on Facebook, go to the comment sections, and you'll see the amount of people who are so confident in their opinions. But for people who know better, you sit down and you say, wow, that person is missing a lot in their argument, and they have a lot more to learn. One of the biggest takeaways I want people to walk away from with this book is it really doubles down on the importance of niching, of specializing, of becoming an expert in something. And you know what? Focus on increasing your competence in that. And everything else, it's okay to listen. It's okay to not have an answer. It's okay to say, my intuition tells me, rather than what I know to be true. We're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble, and we have too much conflict. We have too much arrogance as a result of our overconfidence today. And that core belief from this book is why I love it so much, because it challenges us. And in a world where it doesn't take long to find anything, it's called YouTube, it's called Google. You read one or two articles and all of a sudden you're an expert at something. And you have this idea that once I know just a little bit, I can talk competently about it. It's not true. And that's what I believe you're trying to get at with this book, is to increase your competence more than just come at it with blind confidence.
That's nicely put. And I think, always wrong, but never in doubt is very much how you could summarize some of the phenomena you described. And there is a wonderful quote by the French philosopher and encyclopedist Voltaire in one of his books, I think Candide, that says something along the lines of, doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd. And so we have to understand that there are actually a lot of benefits in being aware of your limitations and even questioning yourself, particularly in an age where the illusion of certainty is easy to have.
So now that we know a little bit more about the dangers of having too much confidence, again, not to say that having confidence is a bad thing, but it's important for us to come back to center and realize that we don't know it all. And in fact, we know very little. So let's keep our minds open to new possibilities, new knowledge, new perspectives, and stop trying to figure everything out and stop trying to say that we know everything, or that we have all the answers, or that we know something to be absolutely true, because we really don't. So now let's kick into golden nugget number 2, which talks all about the better than average bias. Let me ask you a couple questions. Would you consider yourself better than average when it comes to driving? Would you consider yourself better than average when it comes to happiness, your career, your relationships? Would you consider yourself better than average in a number of areas? And the answer to a lot of that is yes. Most people believe they are better than average, which statistically is impossible. So knowing that provides us with a little bit more perspective and understanding, and Tomas is going to go into more detail into that.
But for golden nugget number 2, I'd love for you to explain to us what the better than average bias is all about.
The better than average bias is this idea that most people have, that they are better than average. So a lot of studies have asked people, for example, simple questions such as, do you think you're a better driver than the average person? Do you think you're a better employee than the average person? Do you think your sense of humor is better than average? Do you think your intelligence is higher than average? And so on. So it's been done with virtually every domain of competence. And study after study, domain after domain, you find that something between like 75 and 85% of respondents see themselves as being better than average, which of course is statistically impossible because all these things are normally distributed, which means that the vast majority of us, 66% of us, are very close to average, or in simple terms, average. And yet, it's interesting how narcissistic our culture has become, that if you tell someone that they're average is almost a bigger insult than to tell them that they're weird, odd, or abnormal, because we fear the average. I mean, I think it comes from the consumerist society and, the need to feel special. So, the message here in the narrative is like, you're special, just like everyone else. And my favorite studies have actually told people that there is this bias and that 80% of people think they're better than average, when in fact that's not possible, statistically possible. And then people say, oh, wow, I didn't know about them. And then the studies ask those same individuals, do you think this bias, the better than average bias, applies to you? And 80% of people say no, it's not me, So this is called bias blindness, and it's being blind to the fact that your own thoughts or your own way of evaluating yourself is biased.
I love that, because it's going to force every single one of you listening to this, watching this, to look at the areas in your life which you think you are above average in. And it forced me to take a look at the areas in my life. And as I sat there and read it, and I listened to it again on audiobook, and I sat there and thought about what are the areas in my life that I believe, the areas that you were giving us examples of, like driving and writing and singing and what have you. What do I think my initial answer to that would be? I'm above average in this, I'm above average in that. And then as I sit and think about it, I'm like, well, why do I think that? And is that actually true? And your book forces us to be based on data, scientific studies, to look at that and say, wow, I think I'm one of those people. This book helps to raise your awareness to say, in what areas am I average? And in what areas do I want to be above average? What do I need to do to increase my intelligence or to increase my level of skill in a certain area? And I think, again, it'll help to increase humility across the board when you can say, hey, I'm below average in a certain area and I'm average in this area. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. In fact, I'd argue it's a good thing. To know thyself is power.
So, knowing now that we have this better than average bias, it's important for us to understand where in our lives we might think that we are better than average. And what it is a nice little dose of reality to say, hey, you might not be as good as you think you are, which is a good thing to think because it'll force you to have some humility in certain areas and want you to improve in others. So now let's get into golden nugget number 3, which talks all about the importance of pessimism. Now I'll tell you, for myself, I always thought pessimism was a bad thing, and I wanted to keep pessimism far away from me. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But now my mind has been changed, and I see the value of having pessimistic beliefs. And you might say, come on, Ryan, isn't that a part of your purpose to live an optimistic life? Yes, it is. But that doesn't mean that you can't use pessimism strategically to help you reduce risk in life. And I think today we've gone overboard. We deny the value of pessimism. And then there's others who say that pessimism is really important. And neither are correct. We're right in the middle. The answer is yes and no. Pessimism is both important and it's dangerous, and both optimism is important and dangerous as well. So we need to understand how to use them, and Tomas gives us a little bit more information on that. So let's crack into this one.
So I'd love to understand from you now, going into gold nugget number 3. This was probably the number 2, the second biggest complaint or criticism of the book is that you seem to value pessimism over optimism. Why is that?
Well, I think, we've glorified and celebrated blind optimism for so long now, especially in the West, that we've gone overboard, and I think even good things turn into bad things when exacerbated. And, I think, for example, thinking that things will get better. When I wrote the book, the most recent crisis had been the 2008 financial crisis. So it was easy to pick examples that were related to the economy, So for example, if I think that I can pay off a mortgage, even though I have just 1% of the deposit, and by any rational or objective calculation, only a miracle in house prices increase would enable me to have some equity in my house, and I get a mortgage and I, go into debt, that's probably not a very good thing. So if I think that, despite the statistics out there of how damaging cigarette smoking is, lung cancer can happen to me, because in any area where success and failure or competence can be objectively defined, you realize that there's very little value in being overly optimistic, because being overly optimistic at best can persuade other people that you're good, or that you're healthy, or that you're lucky maybe. And let's face it, this counts for a lot in relationship success and in work with your colleagues. But if what we mean is actual areas where risk and success and failure can be quantified, too much optimism, which is the norm, is quite problematic, So if you think about pessimism, including in some of the cases that we often sanction or ostracize or condemn, such as imposter syndrome, this idea that it's a very, very horrible and neurotic kind of anxious state of affairs when you question yourself and you think you're underprepared for a presentation, and that people aren't going to like your pitch, or that you're underqualified for this, etc. I mean, granted, those are not pleasant states of mind to have or be in, but you can leverage them and turn them into a positive, So I think we have lost, at least culturally, the ability to understand that it is quite advantageous to know when something is potentially risky, dangerous, and that famous old book now, Only the Paranoid Will Survive. That's what I'm trying to get to. And of course, in the last year, we can apply exactly the same theory or model to understanding how people dealt with the pandemic. There are still people today who are COVID-19 deniers and who think this is a hoax, etc. In the early days, it was very easy to fall into this category. And it was probably those who were very pessimistic who said, wow, I should prepare for this and I should take care of myself and my family. Well, those are probably people who didn't get sick, or at least managed the pandemic better. There was a study, by the way, published just 2 weeks ago, showing how people with grandiose narcissism, so those who have a general tendency to be entitled and very arrogant, and also overly optimistic about their talents, see themselves and saw themselves as immune to COVID throughout this pandemic, So you can actually predict behaviors. Now, of course, when everything is going really well and things are fine, you might argue that it's quite a torturing position to be if you're constantly pessimistic. But actually, even that's precisely when you're likely to have your guard down if you're naturally optimistic, And I think the point that I tried to make in that chapter is that it's not easy to change from being a natural pessimist, as I am, to being a natural optimist, as a lot of people are. So we shouldn't point the finger at people who are pessimistic and blame them because they can't see life through rose-tinted glasses or be very happy, because all you're going to create is guilt and annoyance because they can't become someone else.
That's right. I love that you just said that, because that was going to be one of my questions, was to ask, are you naturally more pessimistic or optimistic? A good colleague of mine out of UPenn, Marty Seligman, he has done a tremendous amount of work on the idea of optimism and learned optimism now. And he himself is a very, very strong pessimist. And he continues to do a great deal of research at UPenn with trying to increase optimism. And for him, he says, I have to work to increase my optimism. Now, it's important to also mention that Tomas is not saying that optimism is bad. He led this by saying blind optimism. We talk a lot about the importance of having too much confidence, having too much optimism, because it leads to delusion. And I know that when I've even told people that at first, they've said, no, it doesn't lead to delusion. And it's just this blind acceptance that you can never have too much of these things, but you can. And he's given you some examples where that has been the case. There have been people in my life where having too much optimism and too much confidence led to being underprepared, whether it be for a competition, whether it be for an interview, whether it be for a pitch meeting, and they wanted to rely on their bravado, their ability to sway a room. It wasn't enough. Yes, will it work sometimes? Of course it will. Of course it will. We're not saying it never will, but you're better off being more prepared. And so in this conversation about pessimism and optimism, there's importance to be closer to center, which is to be the realistic optimist. Don't just be blindly optimistic about your future and about how things are. No, look at reality as it is. The rosy colored sunglasses that everyone says are so valuable. I myself am a natural optimist, but I've also realized how that inherent optimism inside of me has gotten me into trouble. And so I need to come closer back to center in order to see things as they are, and then have a more realistic look at what it looks like. And that way I can plan for it. A good example of this is the book, A Man's Search for Meaning, where Viktor Frankl, where
exactly, I was thinking about exactly the same example.
It's such a great example where in the Nazi concentration camps, people were saying, oh, we're going to get out on this day in December, and it's going to happen, and we're going to get out. And I know it. I just know it. And Viktor Frankl would sit and he'd observe and see what happens when that day came and went. What happened to them? They lost hope. That blind optimism that they had, based on what? What was it based off? Where did that come from? How did you come to that date? Why did you believe that date was the one that you were going to come and be saved? And then when it passed by, he saw their hope decline. He saw their resilience decline. He saw everything decline. And eventually some of them even died or committed suicide because they lost all hope. And that's the dangers of blind optimism and where it can lead you. And I know you wanted to bring something in there. I don't know if you wanted to interject there.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, you mentioned Marty Seligman, who has done great work, of course. And it's actually a great example, because when he kickstarted the what then became known as the positive psychology revolution, him and his colleagues made a very valid point that in the previous decades, 90% of psychologists, or at least renowned psychologists, which were mostly psychotherapists, were focused on studying the problems, disorders, abnormalities, and misfortunes that maybe apply to 10% of the people. So positive psychology emerged as a study of what was the norm and what was normal, and a sort of a valoration or a way to revindicate positive emotions, whether it's flow, creativity, etc. And of course, his concept of learned helplessness and then resilience were attempts to help people develop positive coping strategies, which again, you can frame within the positive psychology kind of movement or paradigm. Now, fast forward 30 or 40 years, and I think we've gone overboard in the other direction, because if you want to study or look at the mainstream literature on leadership, for example, you would easily think, or you'll be easily fooled to think, that the majority of leaders must be transformational, inspirational, engaging, amazing. And then if you open the newspapers in any country at any point, you're like, hold on, why aren't these guys here? So which is why we're now seeing a little bit of a shift towards understanding the dark side, etc. But yeah, Viktor Frankl is a great example. In these critical circumstances, if you want to build resilience, you need to cling to meaning and positivity, And the other thought that you evoked was this idea that still today we divide people between optimists, or we called realists mostly depressive realist, because we talk about depressive realism as like, again, it's a lot more uncomfortable to try to come to terms with reality, especially when things are tough. But I would argue it's a requirement or prerequisite to actually cope with the issues. And ultimately, I think that the most important thing is that because you might never actually get a proper, accurate take on reality or have an accurate reading, but what will definitely help you is to know what your specific biases or tendencies are, right? So when you said, I know I'm an optimist, whatever, well, that means that you can probably, because you are self-aware, calibrate or tweak a little bit your, so if you go on a date and no one shows up, or you apply for a job and you really think you're going to get it, or, you think you're going to get promoted, you can pause and say, but you know what, I'm actually quite optimistic. So maybe I should prepare for the negative. And it's the same for me. I always think about the worst case scenario, and I know I'm very pessimistic, and there are moments that I can't sleep because of that. But then I remind myself that maybe I'm just very harsh in my readings of realities, So that's ultimately what we want everyone to be, more self-aware, and that involves understanding in what specific ways you are biased.
So in golden nugget number 3, we talked all about the importance of having pessimism, using pessimism to your advantage. It's something that I will continue to use, and I hope you will as well, because it's a powerful tool for us to gain some better perspective and increase our awareness. But now we kick into golden nugget number 4, which talks all about having an upside from the downside. This is something that's very, very difficult to discuss. It's very triggering for a lot of individuals. When you have anxiety, strong distress, depression, we might think that there's nothing good about that. And trust me, when I've been there in those dark places, it's very hard for anybody to tell me that there's anything good that's going to come from this. Because it makes you feel so bad inside. Feelings of hopelessness and having no hope and seeing no possibility for the future. There's nothing to be excited about, nothing to anticipate. It's a bad place to be. But there is an upside to that. And a part of my work is to help you in understanding what that upside is. So I really hope this doesn't trigger a lot of you. And I hope that you're able to listen to this and maybe learn something from this. But it's something that I myself am going to talk a lot more about and try to raise some awareness to. The importance of listening, learning from anxiety, from distress, depression, and other negative emotions. So let's get into this one.
That's right. As we're moving our way through this interview, I'm hoping that people are now warming up to this book and your work, because this conversation that we're having, it's very hard to disagree. You people out there, you might be disagreeing with it. That's okay. But it all comes down to increasing our self-awareness. And that's a big part about what this book is about. And the other golden nugget that I want to talk about, it's the third most discussed thing or your thing that I faced with an email, and you can see it on the forums and what have you. But people, golden nugget number 3 or 4, it says that there is always an upside to the downside. It's a book by Todd Kashdan, the upside of your downside. And he talks about the upside of things that we don't necessarily think there's an upside to. Anger, psychopathy, even anxiety, depression. And when you called that out in the book, saying that there is an evolutionary advantage to anxiety and depression, immediately people just shut the book. What is he talking about? He's crazy. How dare he say that? It's offensive to me, and it's offensive to people with anxiety and depression. And I would love for you to talk to that and talk to those people who were very offended by the fact that you're saying there is an upside to anxiety and depression. Because I'll be quick and interject real fast, but there truly is.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Todd, again, big fan of his work, great research, and he's written a lot about this as well. Evolutionary psychology is a really interesting paradigm, right? Because when something is quite prevalent and it affects or impacts a lot of people, and that would include things like anxiety disorders or depression or affective disorders, and it keeps on happening, generation after generation, there has to be a purpose, even if its origins are now out of sync or a mismatch, even if in the old days it was something adaptive and today it's mismatched with contextual or environmental challenges. And of course, it's not difficult to understand what the benefits are of things like anxiety or depression or disorders that involve a low self-esteem or having low confidence. Typically, for example, if you are depressed because you lost your job or your partner breaks up with you, or bad things happen, misfortunes, you're mostly depressed because you feel that you are worthless and that you're not as good as you were. You blame yourself, you're guilty, you feel responsibilities. And that's really an attempt from an evolutionary perspective to actually get better, to gain competence, to do, it's your ego, if you like, or your consciousness telling you, hey, you should feel bad about this because you could have avoided it in this way or that way. Now, of course, the problem is that a lot of these times, the inner voice that you have that tells you this is being brutally critical. And if you don't learn to silence it or reframe your interpretation of reality, you might end up being clinically or pathologically insecure, anxious, and inhibited. To be sure, we don't want that. I mean, that's something that psychotherapy addresses. And that's why in those instances when your level of guilt or anxiety or low confidence is out of touch with reality, you need to work on elevating it. But then there's a lot of other scenarios or possibilities where, just look at where we are today. At least in America, 30% of people deal with any negative emotion like anxiety or even concern or worry with medication. So we're killing the symptoms that are trying to tell us something because we don't want to deal with that. And then we become chronically self-medicated prescription drug users. And by the way, that's just prescription drugs, but you can add other substances, illegal drugs or drinking, etc., because we cannot come to terms with potential failures or, basically the common reaction here tells you that we want a quick fix and it's uncomfortable for us to face any wound to our self-esteem. And actually, in many instances, it will be a lot healthier to deal with it and understand that, there's something we can do to get better. And, we're not talking about paralyzing guilt or remorse, but it would be at least healthier to try to deal with it in a psychological way. And that's what I'm trying to argue, So I think, if all people understand is that there are better ways of confronting these issues than quickly taking a pill or a drug, that's good enough for me. Because, and then of course, it is very important to understand the biological, environmental, psychological basis and reasons for depression. There's also some interesting cases that I talk about in the book. For example, if you have so much confidence and entitlement that you are narcissistic, right? And that you think you're as good as your mom told you when you were little, and you think the rest of the world thinks as positively of you as your mom did, at some point you might encounter negative feedback or unexpected kind of failures in your life. And typically when you get to that point, you have two options. You either become depressed and anxious and upset because things weren't as good as you thought. And that's the best case scenario, because then you can actually recalibrate and adjust or tweak your self-esteem and work to get better and avoid failure next time. Or you become totally psychotic and distort reality to kind of continue with that heroic story about yourself that you keep telling yourself. And if you are there, if you're at that level, it's certainly worse. So I think
Mm.
there's always, it's not just that there is an upside to these downside situations, but actually a lot of the times the alternatives are much worse.
We have this natural tendency to want to feel good. We want to feel good immediately. I don't like this pain. Tomas, I don't like the pain that I'm feeling. What do I do? Well, we can get rid of it. And how do I get rid of it as fast as possible? Because I don't like to feel this way. Sometimes, excuse my language, you have to sit in it. You have to sit in it and feel it. You have to sit and think and understand it. Myself going through very difficult times, some of the toughest times in my life came the setups that helped me propel to become a better person, a better community member, a better professional. And it was in those moments of guilt, shame, anxiety, depression, distress that actually helped me the most. And I know that when people listen to this and they read your book and they see that, and if they are in pain, I understand and I empathize, and as I'm sure you do as well, that people, they're going to react that way. It's almost like having an open cut and somebody coming by and just rubbing it really hard. Like, you're going to react immediately to that. And I get that. And I apologize that is your reaction, but this is in no way Tomas saying this or me trying to say that what you're doing is wrong. We're just saying that there is a different perspective that is important to have when it comes to these emotions.
All right, so in Golden Nugget number 4, we talk about something that's very difficult to talk about. The upside to anxiety, to negative emotions. And these things are debilitating. Trust me, I know. But the more we become comfortable with understanding it, or the more we understand a different perspective, the more we can understand it, the better we'll be able to leverage it, to use it to our advantage. And I'm telling you, it is possible, no matter how hard or no matter how solid that belief is, there's nothing good from it. There absolutely is. I will tell you that from firsthand experience. In our last golden nugget, we're going to talk about the importance of listening to others, because we've often heard that we shouldn't necessarily pay attention to what others think, and that the only thing that matters is our own opinion. So Tomas provides us with another alternative perspective, as he so often does. Man, this poor guy, he's just getting beat up all the time on the comments, and I feel for him, but I appreciate him because he's trying to bring some balance back to perhaps an overly optimistic point of view, or a point of view that's just weighing too far on one side. He's trying to bring the pendulum back to center in a few areas, and this is one of them, where we've learned that we shouldn't listen to other people, and we should only listen to ourselves. In this golden nugget, he tells you why that's dangerous to only listen to yourself, and why we should consider the perspective of other people. Let's get into this one.
In the last golden nugget here, my friend, I would love for you to help us understand why we should care about what other people think about us. Because we're told so often that, hey, don't worry about what other people think about you. Other people's opinions of you shouldn't matter. But you in the book say that it actually does matter. Why is that?
It's just a basic ingredient or component of pro-social behavior, living in the company of others, and being part of a civilized society. If you think that ignoring other people's views of you and behaving in the most unfiltered and uncensored way is pro-social in any way, you're just confused. That's that would make you a very self-centered, asocial, or even antisocial individual. I think there is a trap when we listen to suggestions such as, don't worry about what other people think of you, be authentic, you're as good as you think you are, or if you think you're great, you are. Because actually, from an other-centric perspective, I think what we're seeking is to see you for who you really are. And I would like to know that I'm dealing with an authentic version of you, and that you're not trying to deceive me, right? Having said that, and I think the best author here, if you read the work from the 1950s, 1960s, Erving Goffman, the presentation of the self in social environments, nails it basically. First of all, interaction is where the action is. And secondly, every high stakes or relevant instance where we interact with others, whether it's in Zoom or in person, by the way, comes with a specific social etiquette, comes with certain norms and certain rules for interaction, some formal, some informal. And if you just ignore them and you think that you can act in whatever way you feel, you're just going to struggle. I'm just thinking about the number of people who perhaps went to their first job interview and listened to this: just be yourself, don't worry about what people think of you. I mean, I'm guessing 90% of them didn't get the job offer the next day. And as I always say, the real you is someone who maybe 4 or 5 people in the world have learned to tolerate, or maybe even love, as in the unfiltered, uncensored, totally spontaneous and impulsive version of you. I think no more than 4 or 5 people, which is why, by the way, when we meet for Christmas or Thanksgiving or spend too long in lockdown with our relatives, things start getting very rowdy and very problematic, because we don't make an effort to manage ourselves and our reputation there. Right. So, now that doesn't mean that you should not think for yourself, or not have a sense of what's good and what's wrong, or that when no one is watching, you should behave like an immoral crook or something. You should also not violate your core values or be a fraud. But just like you will realize when you travel from your country to another culture, once that is possible again, any situation, if you want to interact effectively with others and deal with other people and influence them and actually make a good impression on them, you have to understand how they see you, and you have to, in a way, be quite populist in the way you behave. Now, again, if you're so shamelessly fake and that you're sucking up to me and you're overly polite and that you're lying to me, there is a price that you will pay for that as well.
That's right.
So I think people want to think that you're authentic, but that type of authenticity requires a lot of dedication, and it's very rehearsed, if you see what I mean. And then, of course, if being authentic, even authentic to your values, means being Saddam Hussein or, Stalin or Lenin, I'd rather you are not authentic and you repress every instance of your behavior, because when we talk about leaders, what we want is not that they are authentic, but that they are effective and have a good impact on others,
This entire book is about balance. You've mentioned it before. I've used the example of the seesaw. You've talked about the pendulum. The pendulum has swung too far in a specific direction, where we say we don't care about what other people think about us. It's only about what you think. You can never have too much optimism. You can never have too much confidence. Anxiety and depression, there is nothing good about that. And when you have this black and white kind of thinking, it really confuses things, and you really need to have a more balanced perspective. And that's why I love this book. And I think this book is highly underrated. And I would highly recommend a lot of you get out there, pick it up. If you've already picked it up and you started to read it and you put it away, I would argue you should pick it back up again and give it a read. Finish it off. And maybe, just maybe, this conversation will help you approach it with maybe more of an open mind.
All right, that's this week's episode of the Cut the Crap Show. So I just want to say thank you to every single one of you for tuning in this week. And I know that this book can challenge you and make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. It might even make you angry. I know that a lot of aspects of this book might be triggering to you. So the fact that you even were able to sit through this episode, I appreciate that. And that's why I love this book. I love the fact that Tomas had the courage to put a book out like this, to challenge a lot of our preconceived notions about how we live life, the certain beliefs that we hold to be true. And I really respect him, because he did put together a really great book that was backed up by some very good research. And I know that if you go online, you read a lot of the comments, they're not going to be very favorable. They're not going to be all that positive. But I will argue that there is a lot of good that we can take from this book. Now, do you have to agree with everything? No. But if there's something here that can challenge a belief that you have to make you see a different perspective that will make you more self-aware, I think that's a victory. In any case, if you want to get out there, pick up this book. It's a great read. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please let me know. Throw me a text message, 1917-540-8169. Just let me know what you thought about this podcast. I enjoyed doing this one, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. But in any case, my friends, I hope you have yourselves a great week, and I will catch you back here next week on the Cut the Crap Show. Have a good one, everybody.